It's always good to welcome a former colleague to the platform, and I'm really pleased to welcome Janet Ryland from the Skills Funding Agency, Janet is Head of Funding and Policy Implementation, and Janet is going to talk to us about a subject that's cropped up a few times today, that's endpoint assessment. Janet.
Okay, so thanks for the introduction, Tony. I'll try not to make this too operational after a sort of very engaging debate on aspects of apprenticeships. I do just think it's part of the English or UK psyche that we always like to have one thing and then we have another. So we've got A levels and GCSEs and other. And those of us who have come up through that other route, who know how good it is, do get frustrated in terms of wanting to articulate how good it is and get us out of this vicious cycle of A levels, GCSEs and others. So just a quick canter through endpoint assessment, and particularly what I want to talk about is the process that the Skills Funding Agency is operating currently, linked to the Register of Apprentice Assessment Organisations. And there will be colleagues here amongst you and speaking tomorrow who actually are from apprentice assessment organisations. And the one caveat I would say here is this is very much something we're developing out of ourselves. So one of the things we say a lot about in the agency is that we want to build the community of practitioners of apprentice assessment organisations. We want to understand what it is to directly deliver independent, separate apprentice assessment. We want to understand the logistics, the challenges, how it operates, and it won't all be there from day one. So those organisations who are currently on the register, around 47 or so approved to offer endpoint assessment against something like 88 standards, they are very much pioneers and they are developing this community themselves and we are indebted to them. So the Register of Apprentice Assessment Organisations, and as Tony said, if you've been debating this during the day, then you don't need me to sort of talk too much about what endpoint assessment is. What differentiates an apprenticeship framework from a standard is that the standard itself sets out the knowledge, skills and behaviours, which may or may not be delivered through a qualification. There will be some mandatory on-programme qualifications, but at the end of the day, the key thing for the standard is that apprentice at the end is assessed by an independent separate organisation and deemed then to have achieved the apprenticeship. Everything else is fairly straightforward on this slide, so I won't sort of go into it except to say, of course, that apprentice assessment organisations will be a range of organisations and they will be overseen ultimately by the Institute for Apprenticeships, and we've not got long now until April in the Institute sort of comes into being. There's a lot of debate about the external quality assurance around independent endpoint assessment. There are sort of 4 separable models of external quality assurance, but the one thing we would say is that every single organisation on the register must have in place its own end-to-end internal quality assurance of undertaking those assessment decisions. So, any organisation that wishes to undertake endpoint assessment needs to be on the register. Okay, we do try and dissuade organisations jumping the gun in promoting themselves when they're not yet approved to be on the register, or indeed approved against a standard they might be promoting themselves for. I said earlier we've got around 46 assessment organisations approved against 88 standards. I think at our last count we had about 3 to 4 apprentice standards where we've got apprentices due to complete within the next 12 months. Those are the priorities. Okay, it will always be a priority for us to have an endpoint assessment organisation or organisations on those standards where we've got apprentice starts. But there's always going to be a slight time lag. We can only open the register for standards when those standards in the assessment plans are approved. I mentioned before that we've got a mixture of apprentice assessment organisations. Yes, many of them are Ofqual recognised awarding organisations, but we also have independent training providers, we have colleges, we have professional bodies, we have employers, we have HEIs. And I think there's a richness in those organisations. What binds them together is they meet the minimum criteria to go on the register. And if you talk to any of those organisations, they will say it is a very different thing about going in and undertaking assessment as set out in the assessment plan. Fairly straightforward process that operates for standards. Every month we will add new assessment organisations to the register, which is available on the Gov UK site. The employer will select an organisation from the register, will inform the provider, the employer, the assessment organisation, the provider then have to sit down and negotiate the terms of their engagement and how they will operate. The assessment organisation will need to have a formal contract in place with the provider because currently the money to pay the assessment organisation is channeled through the provider. The assessment organisation will deliver endpoint assessment, will apply for the certificate from the Skills Funding Agency, and will receive final payment. What I will say is, although we say a lot about endpoint assessment being separate and independent, those 40 or so organisations on the register will always say it is a service. What's really, really important is that there is an early engagement with the provider, with the employer, that those assessment organisations will need to sort out the logistics. They will have responsibilities around confirming eligibility and gateway requirements have been met. So although endpoint assessment is independent, it doesn't mean there cannot be a relationship that's developed with the provider and the employer. Fairly straightforward, employers use the register to select an organisation, and that's really, really important that the employer is selecting the organisation. We know that in some cases the employer might ask the provider to look at that, but in the main, we want to do all we can to ensure that we can have informed employer choice of those organisations. And of course, being on the register is no guarantee that any organisation will be selected. Some employers might decide if there are 3 or 4 organisations, they wish to look at the pros and cons of each. But being on the register is the prerequisite to being selected. And then, as I said, the lead training provider will contract with the endpoint assessment organisation on behalf of the employer, because currently that's the way in which the money will flow to the organisation. Fairly straightforward in terms of what an assessment organisation can and cannot do, or must and must not have. And I'll sort of dwell a bit on this one and then sort of canter through the next few slides. When we were putting together the criteria for endpoint assessment organisations, and we talked to employers about what's really, really important to them, of course, assessment expertise and experience is really important. And if you're really, really, really old like me, then that sort of will be like the OTDLB, or it might be the TAQA. You know, you've got to have people who understand what it is to develop and design assessment tools and to deliver assessment. That goes without saying. But the other thing that employers said was also important is that any organisation coming in to undertake assessment must have occupational credibility. They must have recent and up-to-date occupational knowledge or practice, whatever is defined in the assessment plan. Some assessment plans are more specific than others, but for us, we want that occupational practice stroke knowledge to be recent and then to be refreshed. So one of our questions to organisations applying to the register is about the occupational capacity and capability, but also the type of continuing professional development that those assessors go through to ensure their occupational knowledge is kept up to date and refreshed. I came up through an art and design background, which of its very nature is quite vocational. I think sometime in the Middle Ages was the last time I taught and assessed. I couldn't go in now and assess a graphic design portfolio. My knowledge of modern graphic design stops somewhere around Neville Brody in the face, and that may or may not have some resonance to some of you, but I would just be stunned now to sort of try and assess, because I just haven't got that up-to-date occupational knowledge, although so I think I'm fairly okay on the theory of assessment, but that's really, really important, that the person coming in to assess your apprentices has that occupational credibility. And then the sort of rest of the things is fairly self-explanatory about what the assessment organisation should do. Obviously, it needs the capability, the capacity to design, deliver, endpoint assessment. It needs the infrastructure. It needs particularly to robustly manage any conflicts of interest. And people will always ask about what is a conflict of interest, and we can't legislate for everything. But there must be that clear separation, that anybody going in to assess has nothing to gain, is independent of those apprentices and indeed the organisation within which those apprentices work and study. Fairly straightforward in terms of what we would rather the endpoint assessment didn't do. And again, the last 2 points are really interesting on this slide. Well, they're all interesting, but obviously endpoint assessment has to be delivered in line with the requirements set out in the assessment plan. But the last two in particular, endpoint assessment is not something you contract out. And we're very interested at the moment in understanding more about some of the delivery models. It doesn't mean that if you're an apprentice assessment organisation, you can't sort of contract in resource, but it's not quite the same as delivery of a vocational qualification, where assessors in the college or training provider are assessing. It is about that direct delivery of assessment. So it's not about contracting out. And it's also not about delivering the on-programme learning or the on-programme assessment and the end bit. Providers and employers may well be involved in the process of endpoint assessment, but only one organisation can be solely accountable and responsible for making that final decision, and that's the endpoint assessment organisation. So just very briefly, I've said a lot about the register and how we look for occupational capacity and capability and assessment capacity and capability. It's not a formal procurement, so the Skills Funding Agency is operating and administering the register ultimately on behalf of the Institute for Apprenticeships. We don't have a contractual relationship currently with those organisations, but a bit like the Register of Apprentice Training Providers or training organisations, we do ask for information about the organisation, we look at the financial governance, we do a due diligence, but then the really critical questions are around assessment expertise, including when an organisation will be ready to deliver endpoint assessment, and the occupational capacity and capability. Fairly straightforward stuff about how we evaluate. So we have a sort of governance process, we have internal moderation. It's amazing that we have a number of applications where organisations do not identify a standard, and it's really, really important to identify the standard so we can assess if that occupational profile is correct. I don't know about anybody here, but when I go to the dentist, I would quite like the dental nurse to know something about nursing as opposed to the dental practice manager. I'd rather the nurse look at my teeth than the practice manager, different types of occupational experience and expertise. So we do want an organisation to identify the standards it's applying against. We do reserve the right to refuse to evaluate applications, and then fairly standard stuff about how we evaluate. If there isn't the evidence there that gives us the assurance that that organisation can deliver endpoint assessment robustly, that it's got the occupational profile, that it's got an end-to-end process that looks at the quality assurance. How does it assure the assessment decisions of its assessors? How does it check its multi-choice question banks? How does it ensure fair access to assessment for every individual, so on and so forth? If some of that isn't there, then it's not going to get passed. And we make no apology for stressing quality, not quantity. The bar is deliberately high to ensure that assessment organisations are robust in what they do and how they do it. Oh, there we are. So, at the moment, we use the Bravo solution to look at organisations coming through the register. Register opens every month. We sweep everything that's in there, we evaluate, we update the register monthly. It's a bit clunky, Bravo, so we are looking at whether we can speed things up again. 6 weeks after the end of the month, no limit on the applications an organisation can make or the number of standards it can apply for. What does any organisation thinking about becoming an apprentice assessment organisation need to consider? It needs to consider the resource implications, because it is about delivering it directly. So irrespective of who you are, you need to look at the assessment plan, and if it's asking for a situational judgment test, a professional discussion, a multi-choice test, there are significant resource implications. There are upfront costs of developing assessment tools. There is the readiness to deliver, and that's something we're beginning to look at more and more. Can that organisation be ready to deliver if selected by an employer within 3 months or 6 months of being on the register? We have to think about organisations, particularly if they're coming from a provider background, how they manage that separation, that independence. Have to think about what are the eligible assessment costs. What are the back office functions? Security of test papers, so on and so forth. Premises, for some apprentices, endpoint assessment might be at the employer's premises or the provider's premises, or it might need to be contracted out. The external quality assurance model, so whether the assessment plan is indicated it will go for an Ofqual model, or a professional body, or an employer/sector group, or the IFA. And there are probably all sorts of other things worth mentioning here that will come to the fore as the community of practitioners matures. The only thing I'll sort of finish on with just further information. So where can you find more information about the register? I will give a big plug to the Education and Training Foundation Future Apprenticeship Support Programme, which is looking at a strand of it, looking at apprentice assessment organisations, being taken forward by AELP in the Strategic Development Network. That is a really good programme in terms of supporting organisations interested in making an application and understanding what it means to be an apprentice assessment organisation. And then, of course, information on the Trailblazer standards, on the approved apprenticeship standards, and the actual assessment plans themselves are again available on Gov.uk. That's been a rapid canter round a complex subject, and it's often what lies beneath. What I would say, going back to some of the earlier discussion, is that it's really critical that we build that community. And part of what we're looking to do is move forward together with those organisations to understand what it means to deliver an endpoint assessment to a group of apprentices. And so it'll be interesting to see where we are in 12 months' time. The register itself has now been open for just under 2 years. And when we first opened, I think there were about 9 approved standards, and now there are a lot more. So this is challenging, but it's also worth every bit of the struggle, and it's also indebted to those organisations who are pioneering this through with very robust and high quality. Okay, Tony?